Hello and welcome to Chile Talk. I'm Neil Davidson, this is Pete Lee, and we were going to ask whether Chile was a Western country, but that's going to be a topic for a future episode, because I think we first need to establish whether Chile is actually a country.
Well, Chile is definitely a country. We all know that Chile is like an island, separated by the Pacific Ocean, the Andes, and to the north, the Atacama Desert, from other countries.
Right, it has a flag, a legal system, a president, etc., national anthem, all those things.
It's clearly a country. Now, is it a nation?
Right, because my first idea when I came here was that here we have a place where people speak Spanish, have a Catholic tradition, have a Roman legal system based in Roman law, influenced by the French Revolution, etc., etc., became independent all at roughly the same time. So what's the difference between Chile and somewhere like Argentina or any other Spanish-speaking Catholic country in the Americas?
Largely these states do define one another against one another. That's part of it. But I think as a people, the Chileans are distinct. I'm Australian myself, and I don't like Australia being described as a nation. I can accept the use of national to mean of Australia, but nation makes me a little uncomfortable because to me it evokes ideas of a tribe, and Australia has worked very hard to advance the idea that it's a multicultural society, it's open to different groups with a special status for Aboriginal culture in Australia, and as a result I'm not comfortable with describing Australians as a nation.
Got it. And you could see that same position could equally well apply to Chile. And so I never did see what made it a nation. I think I changed my mind on that. I came to think that Chile was a nation despite all its divisions. It's divided into classes, of course, but also into ethnicities, between the Europeans, the Araucanians, of course, the Mapuche, the mass of the population who are some sort of mixture.
Almost all Chileans are some sort of mixture, 99.97% according to a survey of the DNA of over 3,000 Chileans with 4 grandparents born in Chile. There'd be a few Chileans who don't have 4 grandparents born in Chile, but most do.
That's right. Well, certainly now with recent immigration, but generally that was the case. Okay, so they're all a mixture, but you've got a quite distinct, at least self-identifying kind of European class and a kind of mestizo class. They look different. They do divide into broad groups. And you think, what really holds these people together? And I was struck then during the protests that started last spring, September, October last year, that all the people I knew were shaken by them, severely shaken. They couldn't sleep. Their minds were raging, with thoughts, with anxieties, which my mind wasn't. I could regard the whole thing perfectly dispassionately, even though I've lived here for 20 years. So they weren't just worrying about their lives or property. It wasn't just they thought the mob was going to come and, get rid of all the people who look like Europeans or something like that. Because I was just as much exposed to that as them. So it wasn't that. It was something about their country and the character of their country that was up for grabs and was being fought over. And conversely, I'm English. Previously, during the Brexit referendum, I was so engaged in it that I practically forgot how to speak Spanish. I was just glued to the news, So when there's a crisis, then you find out that yes, you do belong to a nation. And it's not necessarily the one you're in that you happen to be living amongst at the time,
Yes.
So that kind of persuaded me viscerally that Chile was actually a nation, because Argentinians, whatever, observing from across the Andes would have obviously been very interested in what was happening here, but they certainly didn't feel anything like the same stakes, the same involvement, even though they often talk about our Latin American brothers, especially our Argentinian brothers. They're supposed to be very similar, have a great kinship, but they could watch reasonably dispassionately. So this was something peculiar to Chile as a nation. And so what is this thing? I mean, what is a nation then,
Well, the Chilean nation seems to be such an important unit of analysis for the way that Chileans think of themselves. They like to compare their country to other countries. Chile's in the OECD, and that's a wonderful source of comparisons. Chile is in Latin America, which is another wonderful source of comparisons. Chile, despite having fairly low levels of public monies, manages to create a very, very strong national presence in the society. People do think of themselves as Chileans, which I think it's very interesting. The state is not necessarily big when measured in the resources it has at its disposal, but somehow the nationalism is powerful. We often hear how Chile is a very unequal society. Despite having become considerably wealthier, it's marked by extreme inequality. But I think alongside that inequality, there is some consciousness of all being in it together.
That's it. I mean, this is perhaps what holds it together, despite these enormous inequalities and one has to call them injustices. Now, did this arise spontaneously though, or was it invented? I mean, let me take the case of Argentina and say the Falklands. As I understand it, nobody cared much about the Falklands in Argentina until early-ish in the 20th century. I think Perón made an issue of it, and it was incorporated into this kind of mystic nationalism.
And then obviously...
And then which has real-world consequences, of course.
1982, yes.
That's right. I've seen it argued that the Falklands must be Argentinian because they are a continuation of the Andes mountain chain, which goes underwater and then re-emerges at that point. And so this kind of geological approach to defining national rights is something you would hardly find in Europe now, I think. It's because it's an idea that God or nature itself meant this to be part of Argentina.
Yes.
We're in mystical territory now, aren't we?
Yes.
Sure.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. In Chile, we talk of a crazy geography rather than a crazy geology. Chile has created an image of itself largely defined by the way it views itself as an island or as a unit. Which is very interesting in that respect. And in comparison to other parts of Latin America, Chile somehow took advantage of natural barriers from other places to create a state of itself early in the independence process. Despite being a very minor second-tier colony, Chile was able to organise itself, which is interesting.
That's right. And the organisation, one of the reasons to organise itself was to settle the country, to hacer patria. It literally means to make country, to make motherland or fatherland, depending on how you translate it. Partly in reaction to the idea, response to the country was vulnerable. You had in southern Chile, where the Andes are low, it would be very easy for an invading army to cross the border in this very sparsely settled area.
Yes.
And so there's the Pan American Highway, which used to just reach Puerto Montt, the kind of easy part to get to, was then extended as a kind of military project at enormous expense into these very thinly settled southern regions.
Yes.
And so there was this awareness of actively settling the country to claim it, to properly claim the country, which again is seen as something, the border between Chile and Argentina is the top of the Andes. That's the definition, which hasn't actually quite all been even mapped out yet.
Yes.
But that's so. People have this understanding the border as, though the border may not even yet exist, mystically it is already there.
Yes.
The tops of the mountains are the border. In whose eyes? In the eyes of God. I mean, who else is?
Yes.
God has settled the border, and He's waiting for the surveyors to get round to actually finding out where it is.
Yes, and there are obviously many theological understandings of what is a nation historically. I mean, nations, as far as the Romans were concerned, that's how they described the Germanic and other tribes to the north of the empire. People born into the same tribe,
worshipping the same gods, like having the same hallows, the same sacred objects.
Yes, and obviously not incorporated into the Roman way of doing things.
That's right, because I mean, Cicero, who took what we would later consider, I suppose, if we can retrofit the Enlightenment onto him, would take a rather sort of Voltairean approach, defined a nation, I think, as being a community united by common interest.
Yes.
And Augustine, St. Augustine, as he would become, took issue with this and said that a nation is defined by a common love. And that is surely right, you know, and by the love of something sacred. So in the case of these Germanic tribes, it would be their own totems, their own country, no doubt. And I guess in the case of Chile and all modern nations, it's we don't like to talk about it in these mystic terms, but it is that really.
Yes.
A very unusual writer and politician called Miguel Serrano, well, not so much politician, he was Chile's first ambassador to India. He was a kind of Nazi, a racial mystic anyway.
A Nazista, as we call them in Chile, a little bit different to
right.
Nazis.
He has leanings, that's right.
Yes.
That's right.
And very open to the mestizo, the mixed identity of the Chileans.
That's right. He wasn't arguing for a pure European race. That would probably be hopeless in this country. That horse, definitely bolted. And he made great play of Chilean possession of a portion of the Antarctic, which of course is the same portion that's claimed by Argentina, not exactly, but they overlap, by Britain, and I think you said
Peru.
By Peru as well.
There is a Peruvian Antarctica. It doesn't have any bases, but it's projected.
But again, so here God got muddled when he was distributing territories between the nations, didn't he? And he gave the same bit of Antarctica to Argentina, Chile and Britain. Now, Chile is a modern democratic state with a free press, etc., etc. I have never once seen any reference in Chile to the fact that this part of Antarctica is disputed, ever.
No, it's a very strong part of the national identity that there is a Chilean Antarctica.
It seems to be. I asked a writer I've mentioned before, Roberto Merino, after reading some Serrano, I asked him, I was surprised. I said, is this something that actually still means something and appeals to people, this Chilean Antarctic idea? And this is like intrinsic, as Serrano said, to the Chilean soul. And he said, yes, yeah, it is. It is something that we still have.
Yes.
And so as I say, God got muddled up. He gave the same bit to Argentina. And just as in Chile, you won't find any reference at all to the fact that there's a dispute over this claim. Nor will you in Argentina. You go to Argentina and suddenly you have on the maps Argentinian Antarctica.
Yes.
Las Malvinas, the Falklands, no indication of any dispute. So these countries are actually pretty nationalistic, aren't they?
Well, yes. I mean, obviously one of the main founder of the modern state of Israel had a wonderful phrase that he said that he wanted the state of Israel to be a country like any other, with Jewish policemen arresting Jewish prostitutes. There are other citations of that particular phrase. And of course, the state of Israel is a nation like any other in the sense that it's allowed to be itself somewhat. It's a nation like any other in as much as it's allowed to be unlike any other. And that rather applies to the different forms of statehood that are gradually being negotiated in different parts of Latin America. Perhaps most extremely, we have the concept of Bolivia. Now, Bolivia, which used to be high Upper Peru, had a very, very valuable silver mining operation for a while that was basically exhausted by the time that independence came along, and the country was improvised out of different regions that were not particularly organised by the Spanish at any point. Has now, Bolivia, adopted a concept called plurinationality.
In fact, the official name of the country is very tedious when you translate United Nations documents. You can't just call it Bolivia, you have to call it the plurinational state of Bolivia every time. They insist on that.
Yes, and it does have very important ethnicities within it that together make up this state. Ecuador's also adopted plurinationalism. There's some talk of reflecting aspects of plurinationalism in Chile, and apparently the Catholic Church is a great proponent of this approach. It's quite interesting in the case of Chile, which obviously has what we now call original peoples, different indigenous groups that are recognised by the state. By far the largest one is the Mapuche group. Most of central Chile was occupied by people who spoke Mapudungun, their language, prior to the invasion, well, first the invasion by the Incas and then by the Spanish.
That's right. In fact, I think the most heavily populated part of Chile when the Spanish arrived was not by any means the southern part of Chile where Araucania is now, but it was actually the area just south of Santiago, what's now the 6th region.
Yes. And there was there has been a concept of further acknowledgement of the possibility of Indigenous peoples being part of a plurinational state here.
So this is very interesting because here you have people who consider themselves purely Mapuche, whether they are or not, I don't know, and who actually no more consider themselves Chilean than a Welshman might necessarily consider himself English. At the same time, the bulk of the Chilean population is clearly mixed, a mixture of a lot of Mapuche blood with various European and others. And then they actually do consider themselves Chilean, very much so.
Yes.
Which, just to go slightly further afield, when Japan realised its population was collapsing and didn't want unassimilable immigrants, Japan obviously being rather allergic to immigration, they shipped in a large number of Japanese Brazilians, people of pretty much pure Japanese ancestry, and settled them in Brazil to sort of do the menial job, in Japan to do mainly menial jobs, and they could not fit in at all because they were culturally completely Brazilian, completely Peruvian. It had been generations, and they just could never adapt, and they would never accept it. You know, so clearly race as such is pretty meaningless.
Yes.
Culture. I mean, culture is everything, you know.
Yes.
And so here you have people who are Mapuche and consider themselves not Chilean. You have people who are largely Mapuche, consider themselves Chilean. It's not about race, is it?
And you have people who identify politically as Mapuche and Chilean.
And that happens too, yeah. I mean, you have every shade, yeah.
Yeah.
So actually, if we go back to Augustine, it is possible to imagine a very successful multicultural society as long as they have some object of love to fasten onto, you know. And I guess this is this whole nation-building exercise, isn't it, which in all the Latin American countries has been carried on sort of vigorously and in a way that would be impossible now in Australia and Europe to be so overtly nationalistic and nation-building. Here it's respectable.
Yes.
Still.
Well, certainly love is something that has been crafted in Chile through time, both through reproduction itself between peoples, and also in a few important instances on the battlefield. And there's an interesting history of that. Obviously, Chile fought a very famous war from 1879 to 1883, 83 probably.
The grandly named War of the Pacific.
When Chile seized what is now northern Peru from both Bolivia and Peru. Northern Chile. So it seized from both.
Yeah.
Yes, we want to get the nomenclature correct.
Yeah.
But actually, prior to that, there was another war in the 1830s against Bolivia and parts of Peru, allied by other parts of Peru and Argentina, where Chile proved itself on the battlefield, and that caused great pride among the Chileans, particularly in what we call the roto chileno, the broken Chilean.
Or the Chilean with torn clothes,
Yes.
torn is better, who came back from the battlefield in rags, but triumphant.
The common or garden Chilean. Actually, in the War of Independence in Chile, Chileans did not distinguish themselves in battle. They were always losing to under-resourced Spanish forces. And the final victory was effected by an army raised in Argentina, largely, with Chileans in it, obviously, as well. And after independence, Chileans were a little bit tetchy about their bona fides on the battlefield, but this was turned around in the wars against Peru and Bolivia.
Right, I see. Yeah, well, I mean, I guess nothing goes so far towards making a nation as shedding blood for it, because you just can't conceive that your hero's blood could have been shed for no purpose or for something trivial, and therefore it must have been shed for something great. And that great thing, of course, is the nation. The nation becomes great because blood has been shed for it, in a way.
Yes.
You know?
Oh, and certainly, I mean, in more recent times, there are attempts to celebrate the reconciliation of the country after the long military dictatorship in terms of sacrifices towards creating a better state, a better nation, and a better, in general, better. And I think the idea of a shared object of love is very resonant with the Chileans. The Chileans' object of love, I think, is the Chileans. The problem is, sometimes it looks like an unrequited love.
Or perhaps they just don't know how to express it.
Yeah, they're not sure how to express their love for one another, and obviously there's huge nationalism and relief when the football team, when both the men's and the women's now football teams are playing. There's enormous national pride, enormous joy, and some destruction when they win. Incredibly, when the Chilean football teams lose, people seem quite calm.
They go all quiet, don't they? Isn't that interesting? Now you mention it.
Yes, but I think self-love is a large part of Chilean national identity, and it's an unrequited love. People don't quite know how to move it forward, and I think that's part of the impasse that the society finds itself in.
Yes, I mean, perhaps we should probably close soon, but I maybe it's all just a misunderstanding then, because I was very struck that in my street, the neighbours never talk to each other. Very, very suspicious. Then we created a WhatsApp group to fight crime, and they were brought together by this, and suddenly everybody was chatting and exchanging recipes and stuff like that. And they'd always wanted, I think, to love each other, but nobody wanted to be the first one to ring the neighbour's doorbell.
Yes.
They were frightened of making fools of themselves, I think. And I suppose similarly, perhaps the rich would love to, contribute to the greater good. They would like to show solidarity, help the poor. But I suppose, who wants to be the first mug, to part with his money?
Or who wants to be the one to ask?
There's that
to communicate one's love to one another.
That's right. So maybe something will happen. Perhaps the new constitutional convention, and perhaps the floodgates will open, and we will live in a land of brotherly love and all be much happier.
We shall have to see.
Okay, there's a brief little, if we can call it, an analysis of whether Chile is a nation. I think we conclude that it is. And thank you for joining us, and hope to see you again. And if you fancy subscribing and pressing that button, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.